Good day to you this day as we continue through these journey of movies and looking at themes and ideas of them. And I'm continuing this theme that I began with last week, and this is the theme of looking through the movies that were the movies of my high school years. And so the last recording, I had watched the movie. I had watched Men in Black, and so this time I decided to do two movies. And the reason is because I believe there is something interesting to explore with these two movies that came out in 1997. So, like I said, the reason I'm going through these years is because I'm coming up on my 20-year high school reunion. I know people shouldn't talk about that. Oh, no, we know it's 2001. But I know none of my securities are that question, so I'm not worried. So I know some people get worried about that, but it's really a lot easier to find than people realize. But with that being said, so like I said, that's kind of what I'm going through is this theme of these movies from that period in my life. And so I've been going through the movies from starting with the freshman year of high school. And so the first movie, like I said, Men in Black, that was the biggest movie of 1997 in terms of box office, and it was a huge hit during the summer. And so I reviewed that last week. And then this week, I'm looking at these two movies. You see the screen. Scream 2, I Know What You Did Last Summer. These are the two movies. Two movies, slasher films. And the fact that they came out that year, and Scream 1 came out at the very end of 1996. And so the fact that those three movies came out within the span of basically 12 months, granted they were written by the same guy, Kevin Williamson, it does say something about the culture at that time. And before I really get into that, I want to kind of look at the movies individually, one on one. And so we're going to start with I Know What You Did Last Summer. And the reason we're starting there is because, well, that came out earlier. And so you look at the movie, I Know What You Did Last Summer. So I watched this movie, and this is kind of true looking at these movies in general. This one especially, I think this one even more so than Scream 2, the movie really doesn't age well. And I look at it, I'm just looking like, how dumb are these people? And I guess, and it kind of did make these movies really easy fodder for later satire, especially the scary movie films. But the things that stood out, I remember to the movie, is, like I said, the plot was weak. Really, you just look at it like, this guy should die. He's so stupid. How do these people live through this, right? Just kind of have here a little bit, some cast members that were in this movie, and so these were. You see in the top left, you might recognize that guy. You might recognize him as Leonard from the show Big Bang Theory, and so he's in it. I saw him and like, whoa, dude, him. He was also in the Christmas Vacation, if you've ever seen that. But I just thought it was interesting in there, and so, and actually speaking of his character, so this is one of those ridiculous things that happens in the movie where he gets clearly easily outpowered by people, but this guy is carrying around these all this fish, he's carrying around these huge blocks of ice, and the guy can't defend himself worth a darn. This guy, if he's doing the job that he is doing, he should have a lot of upper body strength and should be able to take care of himself. He should not be easily overpowered. And I'm just like, this is... Okay, sorry. All aside. that's just one of those ridiculous things I watch in the movie. And yeah, and so this and it kind of had the same theme in this movie as well as you had in Scream and Scream 2, where she thinks it's the boyfriend. So Jennifer Love Hewitt is the lead girl in this one. And I'll admit, I kind of remembered why back in high school. I thought she was really cute, really attractive. Uh, but she was the lead character, and of course, she thinks that her boyfriend, Freddie Prinze Jr., he's the killer. And by the way, fun story. So you see Sarah Michelle Gellar right there. She was in this movie. These two are now married. And they would go on to be in the Scooby-Doo movies, regrettably. So, just get a little bit of more trivia from these movies. But like I said, the movies, it was a very, like I said, just does not really age well. I don't have all the actors up there. I'm going to pull up I'm just going to quick look up the actors in this movie. So you could kind of, so some other people are in it. So, yeah, you had Jennifer Love Hewitt, Sarah Michelle Gellar, Ryan Felipe was in it. You might know him from movies such as Cruel Intentions. And then, of course, you had Bridget Wilson. She was in there. Anne Hesh. So those are some of the actors or actresses you might be familiar with. But like I said, the movie there's just not a lot to talk to. I wish I could sit here and tell you, oh, this really deep moment happened here and this really smart thing happened here. And it didn't. I'm not going to pretend that there isn't. So I'm going to go over to Scream 2 already. And like I said, there is a reason why we're looking at these movies in particular, is because I do want to explore a theme about, again, why are these type of movies popular? And we're going to come back to that. So Scream 2 was the other big one that came out this year. And so this one came out in December. It was a top film when it was released. Its top billing did not last because at the end of December of 1997, a monster movie would come out. I mean, not like a movie about monsters, but I mean a huge box office hit came. And we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. But Scream 2, look at some of the actors who were... Ooh, my thing's... Sorry if that keeps changing on you. My key bindings. So that kind of probably was confusing. But anyway, Scream 2... Scream 2 was kind of... Well, it came out, and this one was a bit better than I Know What You Did Last Summer. The plot was a little bit better, but again, you still had this really stupid thing. It pained me because, you look at these characters, I mean, some of the actors who were in this, and you have, okay, so look at, there's actually quite a few in here. So you got Neve Campbell, she's the lead. David Arquette, who would eventually be WCW champion in one of the worst moments in the history of pro wrestling. You have... I can't remember who that was. But Timothy Olyphant right here, who's been in a number of movies. Courtney Cox. Then you have from Jackie from... the movie from the show Roseanne, or you might even recognize her as Sheldon Cooper's mother from Big Bang Theory. You have Jerry O'Connell, you have Sarah Michelle Gellar again, and you have Omar Epps. And if you look at the background right here, you got Jada Pinkett, who is now Jada Pinkett Smith, Will Smith's wife. And so, quite a few actors. And then, then here, I gotta think of his name. Liev Schreiber is the other one up there. So Liev Schreiber would play Sabretooth in the Wolverine movie and play a number of other characters. So it actually had quite the cast in this film. And speaking of Sarah Michelle Gellar, I just realized it when I was watching this movie. She had kind of a rough year in terms of characters. In 1997, the major roles that she had four big roles, I guess. One was from some made for TV show that I don't really know anything about, but the ones that I do know about, Buffy the Vampire Slayer premiered in 1997. The season ended. The season finale, she was killed by the Master. I'm a Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan, so I know about all that storyline. She did come back to life, but the bottom line is she did die. In I Know What You Did Last Summer, she was killed again. In Scream 2, she is killed yet again. And so 3 times in 1997 she died in a movie or TV show. And so it was a rough year for Buffy, or for Sarah Michelle Gellar, who is Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And she, in fact, which I kind of find it interesting that she died in 2 movies in that year. Of course, she died in Buffy as well, and she'd eventually die again in Buffy. So she dies a lot. But one of the things that was so painful is watching Sarah Michelle Gellar being so stupid and clueless. So when she's getting chased by Ghostface guy, you see her running up farther and farther up the stairs, and you're just watching. He's like, this is how. I mean, she was shown to be intelligent when she's in this classroom. She's giving intelligent conversations and all that stuff. And I do kind of like the little tidbit where when she's talking on the phone, what happens to be on TV is Nosferatu, which is one of the oldest vampire movies. So I thought that was kind of a cool little bit, because at this point she was known as as Buffy the Vampire Slayer, so that would have been known by this point. So I thought that was kind of a fun little tidbit. But and who the killers are, one of them is obvious. The other one was probably, even looking backwards, I mean, I know how it's going to end, but they didn't really cue it in as strongly as the other. Like I said, it's better than I Know What You Did Last Summer, but it was not a great movie. But the thing is, again, I keep coming back to this question, is why were these movies as big? And Scream 2 does bring in that question, like violence in movies. Does violence in movies lead to violence in reality? And that was a big discussion in the late 90s. You could definitely hear kind of an anti-religious vibe in the film, or anti-conservatism or whatever. There's a little jabs here and there. But that was a big discussion in the 90s, was what led to violence? Because does violence in film beget more violence? And that's always been a discussion. Or violence in video games. Does violence in video games beget more violence? And study after study has shown that's not the case. I know the argument that video games do, video games have got exponentially more violent over the decades, over the years. And by that standard, we should have the most violent society in the history of this country. We should be far more violent than we were in the 1990s. But the reality, because 1990s, your video games were Super Mario Brothers, and I don't think shooting fireballs out of your hands at turtles is exactly, quote, violent. And so, definitely nowhere close to the violence you see in some other games. And so, but the reality was, statistics show, was that the 90s was pretty much the most violent. The 70s, 80s, and 90s were the most violent periods in the history of this country. And there's debate and discussion as to why that was. And there's actually talk that the crime and violence is starting to escalate again more recently. But if it was caused by violence in movies and video games and things like that, it shouldn't just be starting to escalate. It should have been escalated a long time ago. We should be infinitely, exponentially more violent than they were in the 90s. but we're not. And so, and if anything, somebody could make a case based on that, whether that's correlation or causation. But somebody could make a case that maybe, just maybe, the violent movies, the violent video games actually decrease violence in life. That it's an outlet for anger, it's an outlet for frustrations. So there is that case to be made. And so that was a discussion that goes on in the movie, and it's interesting. I even like the part they really love to play into. Okay, the character that is played by I gotta think of his name. Oh yeah, Jamie Kennedy. So Jamie Kennedy, who he ended up being really popular for the Jamie Kennedy experiment. But anyways, Jamie Kennedy's in here, and he plays the role of the good buddy, the film nerd. And so the first movie, he goes through the whole cliches of movies, like who's going to die, who's going to live, and all that stuff. What to expect. And so in this one, he says, we are in the sequel. And I do kind of like the discussion again in that film scene, where they're like, who's going to be, the sequel is always better, is always worse than the original. And I kind of like that discussion. Is which one's better, Terminator 1 or Terminator 2? And I don't know. I've actually had that quite thought of myself. I could go either way. Terminator 2 was revolutionary in terms of special effects. It was a really good action movie, but the first Terminator was almost kind of had a bit of a horror film to it. I do kind of like the fact that they made the case that Godfather was Godfather 2 is better than Godfather 1. I'd say that's up to debate. I think there are definitely people out there that make the case, and you could make a really good case, that the original Godfather was better than the second. So I thought that's kind of a neat little conversation. It really is a conversation that people don't really have that as much anymore. Because in the last 2 decades, we've actually seen it happen quite often, that there have been really good sequels. I mean, look at the superhero movies. Spider-Man 2 was better than Spider-Man 1. The Dark Knight was better than Batman Begins. Captain America, Winter Soldier was better than the first Captain America. There's a lot of examples like that. It seems like to be a lot of them with comic book movies. But there seems to be quite a few examples out there now that there were better than their original. The sequel is better than the first. And so that's you're starting to see that more and more in our generation. So it's kind of interesting, that little conversation that happens in that movie 20 years later. I don't think you have that conversation as much anymore because it's no longer that case. So, like I said, there's elements I kind of liked it when they get into those discussions. They get into some of the philosophical questions of movies, and they even got into a little bit of the political conversation. Like I said, the movie is what it is. It's not a great movie. It's not horrible. If I were to give like a 5-star scale of I Know What You Did Last Summer versus Scream 2, I'd probably go with I Know What You Did Last Summer, maybe 2.5 stars, and I'd say Scream 2 maybe 3, maybe. I don't know. It's kind of hard to go with a good one on them because they're not great movies, and they didn't. Especially I Know What You Did Last Summer did not age well. Scream 2 still. And I kind of do have the disadvantage that I know the story when I go in. I can't go in there and be like, oh, I don't know who it is. I can't go into that mystery thing. I know the answers. I know going into it. And this is actually going to get into this is going to lead me to the question. Return me to the beginning question. Why are these movies so popular? Why were they so big in 1997? Why were we so big on these slasher films? And I had to think about it. I had to think about this for a while. So the 90s, when it came to cinema, and I'm going to talk about this more in later movies, but in the 90s, you had postmodernism. You had a movement, a new worldview in society. And a lot of movies in the 90s, you could look at it, you could point to the post modernity in it. Um, a lot of the movies of the 90s had to deal with the failure of technology, the failure of the promise of science. And we'll get to that more probably with one of the movies in the 1999 movies. We're going to really dig into this question. But actually, even the movie that ended in 1997 goes into this question. But that doesn't really fit with Scream 2 or I Know What You Did Last Summer because it's really not about the promises of technology. And so I had to think about it because slasher films, films where stupid teenagers end up dead, was far from a new thing. It was far from a phenomenon in the 90s. I mean, we still have them all the time. Except for now they could get a little bit more supernaturally than they used to be. But they've always happened. What was different between the Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer films and say Halloween or Friday the 13th? And the answer is in who's the killer? Who was the killer in I Know What You Did in Halloween? Well, it's Michael Myers. The entire time you're watching the movie, you know exactly who the killer is. The same held true for most of the Friday the 13th films, with the exception of the first one. You know the whole time it's Jason Voorhees. You watch Nightmare Before Elm Street, you know the whole time it's going to be Freddy Krueger. When you come into Scream 2, you come into the first Scream, or the second one, or the third one, you haven't seen the movie yet. Who's the killer? Do you know? Do you know going in? No, you don't. You just know it's some dude in a ghost face. That's it. The whole movie is trying to guess who is the killer. And your characters are having serious trust issues. It could be this person. It could be that person. I can't trust my boyfriend. I can't trust my friends. Maybe it's this other guy. Same thing with I Know What You Did Last Summer. You don't know who it is. And this makes a lot of sense. Because you got to think about the generation that would be growing up into these movies is your Generation Xers. See, Gen X are the people that they were basically trained and raised to fear everything. They're the one. We were raised with that generation. Don't talk to strangers. Don't take candy from strangers. Don't accept rides from strangers. Good advice, right? But we were inundated in our minds to fear, to be afraid of that unknown stranger, that unknown danger, stranger danger, you're told. And that's what it's playing into. The kids that grew up on this are now, they're in high school, they're in college or whatever, and now they are watching these movies. This is the kids who are watching these movies, a lot of them are parents now as we speak. And they tend to be what you call the helicopter parents. This is characteristic of Gen X because Gen X tends to be afraid and overly cautious. And so they kind of have this mindset that everyone's out to get their kids. Everyone's out to get everyone. And that is getting reflected in these films that they were so popular. Because there is no doubt, if you were a senior in 1997, you are firmly in Generation X. And so that is what it's doing. This is kind of a really interesting perspective on the culture. You don't trust anyone. And it actually says something about the parents now. Your baby boomer parents tend to just kind of let their kids go, well, do whatever. They just go live and let live. And that's probably how the millennials are going to be too. Kind of the way parenting is usually it's a back and forth. So let's see, what it would be, the greatest generation that was before the boomers, I think. The greatest generation, I think that was them. Uh, or was it no? Or the silent generation? Silent generation, yeah. Silent generation. They were kind of helicopter. They're very, watched everything. Baby boomers, loose. Gen X, helicopters. Millennials, loose. Probably your Gen Z are going to become helicopter. It's like back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and that's the way it tends to go. And so Gen X is very much that helicopter parenting, and Scream, I Know What You Did Last Summer, is reflective of why they are that way. And so I thought that was just kind of an interesting little thought into how these movies got to be so popular. And, kids, if you happen to be a teenager and by random chance you happen to be watching this, and if you're wondering why your parents are so afraid and they're so overly protective, it's because they grew up in this generation. They grew up in the generation where they were taught to fear everything. And to be fair, there was reasons, because they heard the stories, they saw the news, they saw these horrible things that happened to kids, they heard about these horrible things that happened to kids, and so they were learned and they were taught to be afraid of everything. And so, again, they get to high school, they get to college, everyone's a creeper or creepy or whatever, and maybe that guy's a killer. Maybe that guy's going to do this, or maybe that guy. They didn't have an obvious... See, the people who grew up with the Halloween films, the Friday the 13th films, in that generation, evil had a face. It's definitive. You always knew who the evil person was. It's easy. He's the guy that had the worn-out William Shatner mask, like Mike Myers. He's the one with the hockey mask. He's obviously the villain. The guy that's burned up, he's obviously the villain. But the one that might be your boyfriend? Or how about this one that's just a really good friend that you just have a good time with all the time? Could it be him? Or maybe this lady over here. I mean, who could it be? And see, that's it. It was the world where it's like you don't trust anybody. You don't barely even trust your own family, because there's in the first Scream they're trying to say that it was the father that was doing all the killing, and that's the whole thing is in these movies, it's kind of setting you in the mindset to trust nobody but yourself, and maybe your kids, but even then they might convince you that your kids might try to turn on you, and so. That is how these movies come to be. That's how they became popular. And they were popular for a time and I say that for a time because you get into the 2000s when the millennials started to be more of those in high school. You didn't see as many of these Scream, I Know What You Did Last Summer. Instead, you got the parody films. You got the scary movie films. And instead, you started getting movies like The Ring and things like that, where it's more supernatural and just weird. And this don't trust anybody theme went away because they weren't as much risen on that. But I think that your Gen Z, I think that you're going to see the movies that is made for them when they get to be adults. I think they're going to have more of those don't trust anybody. And the reason is because the Gen Xers, they're don't trust strangers, people offering candy and all that stuff. That's what they grew up with. The Gen Z kids, they grew up... So millennials grew up with technology. As technology evolved, as computers and all that stuff. But when they had it, it was hopeful. It was still a really good thing. But Gen Z, they are growing up in the midst of the bad of technology. They know about the dangers that come through social media and the internet and stuff like that. And so I believe that you're going to start. I mean, you've already seen some of there. I think there was a movie. Um, what was it called? Unfriended or something like that came out a few years ago, and I think you're gonna see that more. You're gonna start to see movies where you're gonna see the slasher films that are based upon fear surrounding technology. And I think if that is going to be the new, I Know What You Did Last Summer, Scream type films for this current generation, I believe they're going to become helicopter parents, especially in regards to technology. But before they rise at that parent status, they're going to watch these movies that reinforce for them fear of the current world, the fear of technology and what it can do. And by the way, interestingly, is that ties back in to one of the tenets of the postmodern worldview, and that is that science, technology, which for the modernists, science and technology was supposed to solve anything. It was supposed to end war and disease, etc., etc. And what you're going to find in the postmodernist is that they are rejecting and showing, they're trying to say that this was a lie. Technology did not give us the promise. And this is going to come out. So next week, the movie I'm going to do, I would have normally done the big movie that closed off 1997. And I would have normally done that. But the reason I'm not going to do that this time, next week, is because next week is 4th of July. And so I'm going to want to do a movie that's more 4th of July-ish. And so I'm going to go with a movie that came out in 2000, which would be The Patriot. But the movie that came out at the end of 1997 was the Titanic. Was Titanic, which was for about 10 years was the highest grossing film in the history of cinema. And that is a movie that perfectly fits into the postmodern mindset of technology failing, because in the case of that, or another movie that I'm probably going to do, I had thought about doing next week, but I decided not to, because I wanted to get another one that kind of goes with that is Saving Private Ryan, the Schindler's List. Those are historical examples of the promise of science failing. So Holocaust, you saw people using medical technology, using this technological advances to kill mass amounts of people. And the devastation of, you especially see on the beaches of Normandy, the invasion on D-Day, you see the grotesque, the horrible things that came from technology. Titanic was this incredible marvel that failed. And so that goes with that generation, that idea of failure. And when we get into the 1999 films, we're going to show how there's some more creative, those are historical examples, but you'll find we're going to start talking about movies that were not historical examples of this, but were more science fiction films that really play into this failure of technology, the failure of the promise of science. And that kind of is the way it goes basically until 2000. At the end of 2001 is when you start to see a shift in film, because basically much of the 90s, the theme of movies was fear of failure, the fear of what these things had promised. We were promised we should be safe at our home, and it's not. And so we watch these things like I Know What You Did Last Summer, Scream 2, to show that you are not safe wherever. You're not safe at school, you're not safe at college, you're not safe at home. Everyone's trying to kill you type thing. You know, you're reminded of how technology has failed through things like Titanic. No, I Know What You Did with Schindler's List or whatever. And that's what the 90s is. It's all about that negativity of fear of the world. When you get to the end of 2000, actually really 1999 is you'll get the start of this change. But it's not really until 2001 where it fully starts to shift into this more positive vibe, this more hopeful vibe. But like I said, we'll get to that more when we deal with some of the later movies. But like I said, the movies of an era, of a time period, can tell you so much about a culture, so much about what the world was like at that time. And because I mean, we're just talking about movies just 20 years ago or 24 years ago. It tells us about now because these people for whom these movies were targeted are parents. They're parents of teenagers. And why they parent the way they do. These movies are a window into that examination, into that understanding. So, uh, with that, that's where I'm going to stop. That's where I'm going to end. And I'm going to come back next week, and we are going to look at the movie The Patriot, which came out in, I believe, in 2000. So, because it kind of ties in with my theme of movies during my high school years, but it also ties in with 4th of July. So, blessings to you in Jesus' name. Amen.